The huge rooms of a country house required armfuls of tall flowers. Each year this crop occupied a large area within the walled garden. In the plot Harry's earmarked, the gladiolus corms are already planted. Now conditions are right for him to prepare the rest of the ground for seed sowing.
Oh, that's great, John. The conditions are perfect, and this bit of dust in April is lovely to see. The ground's worked down far better than I thought. When walking over it, it's like walking on velvet. And after all the heavy rains we've had and the total lack of frost, this has come down to a perfect condition. Absolutely ideal.
The garden writer William Robinson reckoned that the output from such a plot was equal to that of 20 plant houses. In the summer there will be larkspur, and for the winter the cheering brightness of the everlasting flowers, acrylinium and helichrysum, as well as rows of dahlias and chrysanthemums. The delicate tints of the aquilegias give the herbaceous border its first burst of colour. Many varieties had long flourished in Britain, but the Victorians introduced more species from Europe and North America. Until flowers are ready for cutting from the open ground, Harry depends on tall, showy schizanthus, or poor man's orchid, available from the glasshouse range.
They could be used in the mansions, in groups, and very often they went out to functions. For Easter, they were used in the church decorations. Unfortunately, they have been grown too warm. They really want to be in a cold house, which it is possible to just keep the frost out, and then they produce a much more compact plant, but still quite spectacular in height. They will go about 3 feet, 3 feet 6. Far, far better than the modern ones today, which they've shut down in height to only about 12 inches.
Above them hang the bell-shaped abutilons. To my surprise, one manual claims that they're ideal buttonhole flowers and good for making bouquets. And below, the aptly named cigar plant. The Victorians introduced so many plants from abroad that it's easy to forget that some were developed from our native wildflowers. The pansy, pampered and widely exhibited as it later became, was one such. It had very humble beginnings. Its ancestry traces back to the insignificant weed that grows in cornfields and hedgerows. The little heartsease had been a favourite wildflower for centuries, but it wasn't until 1814 that Lord Gambier collected some from his estate and gave them to his gardener, William Thompson, to cultivate. And at that moment, a farm weed became a garden plant. Over the next 30 years, Thompson became known as the father of the heartsease. as slowly as efforts were rewarded with brighter colours, larger flowers, and a more rounded shape. Then, as so often happens, the really important improvement came by chance. A seedling pansy in a bed of heathers. And, in William Thompson's own words, the little flower seemed like a miniature cat's face, steadfastly gazing at me. From this chance beginning, the pansy fell into the hands of enthusiasts whose ambition it was to exhibit a flower of perfect outline, well-defined margins and deeper colours. Under the fostering care of the florists, the pansy left the garden border to become the darling of the show tent. Yet these hybrids lacked vigour and became superseded by a Belgian import. Known as the Fancy, this robust strain was the forerunner of today's giant pansies. The pansy is a little fastidious, but not severely so. It thrives in a cool climate with partial shade and in a rich, moist, sandy soil. Following this advice, Harry finds the best spot in the garden for our collection to be planted out.
I think, personally, dahlia on this north-facing border will be absolutely ideal for them. We get pansy disease easy in this area, and also in a summer with a reasonable bit of sun, this land drains out too quickly, and that is not good to them. We've worked some farmyard manure into the border and a bit of leaf soil. It keeps pretty damp down here, and after about 10 o'clock in the morning, it's completely sunless.
Another old favourite improved by the Victorians was the sweet pea. It had come to these shores from Sicily in 1699, but was little developed during the following 150 years. The writer, Jane Loudon, thought it an ideal plant to be tended by the lady of the house, as it required continual watering, tying up, and cutting off of dead flowers. By 1840, there was still only a narrow range of colours, but this man was to change all that. Henry Eckford, head gardener at Borreton Park in Shropshire, made a name for himself, raising new varieties of sweet pea. It was a success he light-heartedly attributed to this bent silver threepenny piece, a talisman he'd always carried with him since leaving his native Scotland. In 1888, with his lucky coin in his pocket, Henry Eckford moved 6 miles down the road to this house in the small market town of Wem. As a head gardener, he'd been so successful in growing and selling sweet peas that he decided to rent some land and set up as a seedsman. The soil and weather conditions of the area seems to have suited the sweet pea. Within a few years, he'd made Wem the centre of sweet pea cultivation. His nurseries were extensive, and buyers came not only from this country but from overseas to see the new varieties he'd bred. America was equally affected by the sweet pea craze. One of Eckford's frequent visitors was their leading breeder, W. Attlee Burpee, seen here honouring his friend by wearing an Eckford sweet pea. The Philadelphian nurseryman would have recognised the quality of the new varieties Eckford had raised. He would have found the flowers exceptionally large and graceful, but perhaps he would have been most impressed by their colours, no longer just purple, pink or white, but blues like this Cheshire blue, or dark red. This bright orange he named after himself, and the more sober cream one after his daughter Dorothy. Eckford's achievements were all the greater, as for hundreds of years the sweet pea had resisted all attempts to hybridise it. They're peculiar plants because they self-pollinate at this stage, long before the flowers are open. So the only hope of making a hybrid is to find some buds, prise open the flowers, split the keel apart, and with a pair of tweezers take out the stamens. Then take a stamen from another variety, rub pollen on the stigma, and that should produce hybrid seed. But Eckford had to share the glory of the modern sweet pea. An accident of nature played its part. One morning in 1899, Silas Cole, head gardener to the Earl of Spencer, noticed that on one of his sweet pea plants, the flower petals were not smooth, but waved and frilly. That discovery marked the next chapter in the fortunes of the sweet pea and gave rise to all these modern varieties, which are still known today as Spencer types. They took the sweet pea world by storm, and soon the old grandifloras, including the 200 varieties bred by Eckford, were neglected and forgotten. Eckford died in 1905. A colleague wrote of him shortly after his death. He walked among his sweet pea acres with toddling grandchildren about him. Hobnobbed affectionately with such old florist friends as went to see him. Talked about the dear companions of his youth, and on his deathbed smiled serenely on the world that he was leaving, without fear and without regret. The sweet pea was grown for cut flower. It played little part in the practice that dominated Victorian gardens for most of the century, bedding out. The arrival from South America and South Africa of hundreds of brightly coloured plants stimulated the massing of flowers in formal beds. At first the star was simple, but gradually competition and the expertise of gardeners led to more ambitious designs, like this heraldic terrace at Castle Ashby. Then it was found that small tufted plants and succulents with coloured foliage could be arranged in complex patterns to produce a flat bed that resembled a carpet. This was a refinement that gave the head gardener a new headache: mathematics. Harry's taken up the challenge.
Marking out a carpet bed was something which I'd never had any experience of at all. I had read about it and I'd listened to men who'd done such a thing, and I had seen many examples of carpet bedding, how beautiful they could be. The size of this bed is 10 feet. it was only half of the size of the original plan which we took out of a book. But this book and one or two other books have never described how many plants we required. And that was going to be a monumental task because these plants all had to be raised. I had no idea whether they were planted as ordinary bedding where they were allowed to fill out as a plant would do and then keep it restricted, or where one planted on a colossally overplanted, I would call it, scale, and keep them starved and pinched in that position.
Because the plants were chosen for their leaves and not their flowers, they were effective the whole summer through. Some had to be trimmed to keep them in shape, but careful selection allowed patterns to be created that had the intricacy and geometric form of a Turkish carpet.
Removing the turf, of course, is quite simple. We use the old turfing iron. Something, again, a tool which I never ever really mastered, and I'll be the first to say so. Very often or after a time, my turfing iron comes up through the turf, so you better all watch out. When we've removed the turf, we will proceed to get the soil under the turf made into a condition ready to receive our plants. The centre stake, we will leave that in the middle all the time because we've now got to mark out the plans that we're going to plant to on the border. So we'll go back to the office and we'll work this out.
This was a task not always readily accomplished by the average Victorian gardener. A writer to the Journal of Horticulture in 1861 complained that he had to get the local schoolmaster to help him out. His employer wanted a design of 3 oval beds, each to vary accurately in its proportions relative to the others. Harry's design is taken from Cassell's Popular Gardening.
This plan was supposed to be a simple and easy to work one. Unfortunately, drawing at school was not one of my great subjects. It's taken a lot of study and working out, and I've wasted quite an amount of paper on it, but I think I'm getting there.
The instructions are at best cryptic, but what Harry has to achieve is a pattern of 6 petals with their points evenly spaced around the circle. The Journal of Horticulture warned that if the points extended outside the circle, a gentleman escorting a lady had to tread with care. The lady's attention is so taken up with the flowers that she is in danger of treading on these sharp points at every turn, and the poor man must keep his eye open to save the lady from an unfortunate tumble.
We've got to mark out the pattern by moving this string across and keeping it taut on the end, and it marks right across the bed. And we move around, and in the end we will get the pattern we want. It was done by I think we got 6 petals to do. Yeah, 6 stakes are driven in, and then the line goes from the one peg right across the bed to the other. It ends up the other side, and then you move on a peg and you do the same thing again. And after you've done a few of those, then you can begin to see how it's coming. And although I have to stop and think each move before I make it, quite quickly I can see how this is going to work out.
The quantities of plants that had taken up valuable space in the glasshouses during the winter first had to be hardened off in the frame yard before being taken to the terrace or parterre. Many a gardener grumbled about the time and space they took up. Not surprising when a carpet bed could use 30 plants to the square foot.
Hey John, you start digging up the pyrethrum. At this stage, I've not had a time to really count up what we want, but it must be in the region to 2,000 to 3,000 plants for this 10-foot bed. The plan we're copying was a 20-foot bed. I'm sure the labour intensity must have been one of the reasons why so many of them fell out of being. To fill up the beds, which many of these mansions had as the years rolled by, to have done anything like that on a carpet bed scale would have been a monumental task, because labour numbers had dropped considerably by the time I came on the scene to what it was in the early part of this century. Hang on, lads, I've got a corded line to pick up in here. Well, in a bed this shape, the first plant to go in is the central plant. If you don't do the centre first, of course, you can't get into it afterwards, other than by placing boxes or something at the side and then working off of planks, which is rather difficult. A bed this size is comparatively easy by placing the middle one in first. Then we've got a ring to go around this of plants. We'll plant that ring, and then from then onwards, of course, you'll get up and work your way back out through each pattern.
The carpet bed was not without its critics among the leaders of garden fashion. William Robinson lambasted all such work as wrong and degrading to art, and, in its extreme expression, ridiculous. Ridiculous or not, few gardeners were spared the long hours of planting and upkeep such beds entailed. In the centre of each triangle, a dark, purple-leaved aeonium. The book specified a dwarf lobelia as the infill for the petal. Such close planting ensures that the soil is quickly covered. If the bed is regularly trimmed like a lawn, the design remains clear throughout the summer. The petal's outline is etched with a low-growing pyrethrum, aptly named gold feather. Finally, the gap between petal and triangle is picked out with a blue-grey succulent echeveria.
Having planted it and stood back and looked at it, I was really pleased, I really was. It had been quite a bit of aggro with raising some of it, and now to see it in the bed and see all that lot of spare plants on the grass, my first reaction, of course, was, well, with all this lot, we could have done the real thing.